Well, welcome to the Faith Roots podcast. Lovely to have you back with us. I've watching on YouTube or listening in on the audio. And today I wanted to talk about blame and responsibility. Blame and responsibility. And I want to pick up on three linked stories that I've seen in the media this week. Three that you will have seen as well. You won't have been able to miss them. And they all revolve around Partygate. Last week I talked about whether or not the Prime Minister had been ambushed by a cake at one of these alleged parties. On Monday we had Sue Gray's initial report, or update as she referred to it, into these parties and events that happened in Downing Street, or allegedly happened in Downing Street. I guess we probably should say that until police inquiries and court cases are complete, through the lockdowns. And out of that comes a few things. First of all, there are the things that Sue Gray has reported on herself and the things that the police are now investigating. And there what you see is this is as a description, not just of specific events, but a whole culture, a whole way of relating to the law and to relating to one another. And as I think I've said before, that probably helps us to get to think about what was going on and how you ended up in a situation where people could claim, with there being this sort of kernel of truth in the claim, whatever you made of whether or not this really was justifiable. But people could claim that they turned up at events or they witnessed events and thought that they were part of day-to-day work and not parties. It's how, I guess, the Chancellor of the Exchequer could say that he thought that he'd arrived at a meeting about COVID and COVID strategies, to be surprised to be ambushed with the Prime Minister's birthday cake. And what you pick up when you read Sue Gray's report is this kind of culture that arose out of, you had this building that on the one hand is the private residence of the Prime Minister and his family, and also the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with its garden at the back. But in fact, is also this workspace, this office block, with about 400, 500 people turning up to work there every day. And many of them, because of the nature of the pandemic and the nature of their work, in effect being essential workers and key workers and needing to be there throughout the pandemic. So that mixing of those things that included alcohol. So Gray, I think, talks about inappropriate or excessive levels of alcohol being consumed in the workplace, which left people asking what would be acceptable, what is a necessary level of alcohol consumption. And so you get this kind of culture where distinctions are blurred. Now, I've also said that I believe that when you look at the culture, the ethos within the particular administration that we have in place now and the personalities involved, that there does seem to be a tendency towards what we might call exceptionalism, the belief that I am an exceptional case. And so the permission then to push the boundaries of what was permitted. Not as I've written this week, that this would mean that everybody in Downing Street and in the government was breaking all of the laws, all of the rules, all of the time. But you get a situation where people who would have made sacrifices in the pandemic would, like you and me, have not been able to visit elderly relatives, not been able to go on their holidays, but would have felt that they were permitted some leeway in the decisions that they made. So that was the background. That's story number one and the foundational story to the other two. Here's the second story. Someone who I think is a former senior civil servant wrote a newspaper column this week. And he argued that one of the biggest concerns in terms of how the matter had been reported, both in the official reports and in the media and debated in Parliament, his concern was that that was going to have a negative impact on the civil service, that it would bring the civil service into disrepute and make life challenging for people who want to be part of the civil service and want to be doing a good job and affect their motivation. And to some extent, I agree. Until you read what he's saying, because his argument then is effectively the civil servants and the civil service are absolved of all blame. They are the victims here. And it is all the politicians' fault because the politicians have led, the politicians have set the tone. And so you can't look to the senior civil servants and hold them accountable for the culture that was operating in Downing Street. Is that right? I wonder. Because the politicians do come and go, don't they? So the civil service is meant to remain and run and function and have its own culture independent of the political culture of the day. That's what we expect of them. That where the politicians come in with their ambitions and their agendas and their own particular outlook, the civil service has its own culture of service, and that it is primarily there to serve society, to serve us by ensuring that the government's agenda can be implemented, the one that we voted for, but also that the government doesn't overstep the boundaries of good governance. Here's the third story, and I've debated about whether or not to talk about this. In my head, I've been running through this kind of inner dialogue because this is a very difficult one. On Monday, when the Prime Minister was in the House of Commons and was being challenged by Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, he made what perhaps he considered a throwaway comment to the effect that when Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions and therefore responsible for which criminal cases went to court and were prosecuted, that the CPS, Criminal Prosecution Service, were too busy prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile. Now, Jimmy Savile was a celebrity, a DJ that went on to be a famous TV presenter, presented Top of the Pops, presented his own programme called Jim'll Fix It, and was seen as this guy who did a lot for charity back in the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of people wanted to be associated with Jimmy Savile. Now, fascinating, I remember my grandma, my dear, insightful, discerning grandma, saying there's something not right about that man. And lots of people have since said, we always knew there was something wrong about him. And what came out about Jimmy Savile was that he was a predatory paedophile who had managed to use his position to gain access to young and vulnerable children, including those with disabilities, and to assault and abuse. And that was what the Prime Minister was referring to, that back in about 2008, 2009, the complaints were actually coming in and registering with the CPS. But a decision was made not to prosecute, that the evidence threshold wasn't crossed to prosecute him. And that was at the point when Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions. Now, a few years later, in fact it was after Jimmy Savile died, the mounting crashing weight of evidence showed that decision had been wrong, that Jimmy Savile should have been prosecuted, and victims were left without justice. Because in this life Jimmy Savile got away with it. I believe in the God who holds people to account in eternity, so I don't think he did get away with it ultimately. But in terms of seeing human, earthly, timely justice, that was lost. There were investigations, and in fact Sir Keir, as the Director of Public Prosecutions, acknowledged that his department, his organisation had failed, that there were systemic issues that affected what happened. And as a result of that, made changes. So there's the background. Now here's something very crucial, and why, understandably, Sir Keir Starmer and others found the Prime Minister's comments deeply distasteful, and he's been criticised severely even by his own MPs for this. And you'll have noticed, I think, Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, and others just failing to be able to find a way of justifying what the Prime Minister said, and certainly holding back from making the same claims themselves. Here's the first reason. The first reason is that while Sir Keir Starmer headed up the CPS as the Director of Public Prosecutions, it wasn't his decision not to prosecute. It was another lawyer on the team responsible for a particular area, a geographical area, an area of justice. And so the case didn't cross Sir Keir's desk. He wasn't consulted, he didn't advise. It was not his decision that Jimmy Savile shouldn't be prosecuted. And for the Prime Minister to imply, which seemed to be the gist of it, that Sir Keir Starmer himself was personally more interested than chasing journalists in some kind of, I presume, some agenda against free speech to protect the government of the time, which was a Labour government. For the Prime Minister to suggest that is actually to smear the leader of the opposition. Absolutely disgraceful to do that. And secondly, we need to put that in context. This was not about a sober debate looking at our legal system and the problems within it. It wasn't a sober debate about bringing people to justice or about protecting the vulnerable. And we have to be clear and say this. It's very clear, very obvious that it wasn't the Prime Minister's motive to actually encourage that serious debate. This was about defending himself and deflecting attention and scoring cheap political points to distract from the scrutiny of his own behaviour. In fact, I would say that what you then saw in terms of that behaviour in the House of Commons backfired, because it merely intensified and further highlighted the culture, the character of our leading politicians and of the Prime Minister. That's how they behave. That kind of, in effect, gaslighting approach of throwing accusations back at others, smearing others, blackening their name, that because you can't deny your own culpability, and so you simply poison the water for everyone and drag everyone else down with you. And that's serious, because that is one of the things that makes our political culture so toxic. And if a fish rots from the head, then a government and a parliament and a country will rot from the head. So how our leaders act and behave matters, because their behaviour affects the rest of the culture. They are both a product of the culture around them. This culture, this society, created the persona, the character, Boris Johnson. Just as it created that persona, that culture of Jeremy Corbyn and others along the way. But also, the leader shapes and influences the culture. And I know actually that is relevant to what happened at the CPS. Because this is where we can't ignore what happened between 2008 and 2010. Because if Boris Johnson bears responsibility for the type of culture in Downing Street and the culture in Parliament and the culture in the country and all of those things that are happening, so too did Keir Starmer bear responsibility for the systems, the cultures in place in the CPS. In other words, if there were failings that reflected not just individual mistakes, but the systems and how things functioned within the CPS under his under his watch, then yes, Sir Keir Starmer is responsible. Now here's the thing, and I think there is actually a marked difference here. The point is that isn't actually controversial, because Sir Keir Starmer, as the Director of Public Prosecutions, as things came out, took responsibility. And so he did two things. He apologised for the failing, and he took steps to correct it, to review and to reform how the CPS operated. Now, whether they got everything right, whether things are where they should be, is perhaps a debate for another day. But the point is this: he took responsibility. And that's what leaders should do. It's helpful at this stage to make a distinction between blame and responsibility. Blame means that I'm culpable. It's my specific actions, my decisions, my behaviour. I'm the one who did wrong. And that is what is still under investigation in Downing Street, isn't it? Not just whether the Prime Minister was responsible, but also whether he carries blame and guilt. Responsibility is slightly different. I can be responsible for things and should take responsibility for everything under my watch, but I may not be to blame. I take responsibility and say that happened under my watch. The buck stops with me. But that isn't to say that I'm the guilty party here. I believe that means that leaders, politicians, senior managers and business owners have to take responsibility for what happens in their departments, in their organisations. That's why, back in the good old days, when something went wrong in a government department, whether or not they were personally responsible, the expectation, the honourable expectation was that the senior minister, right up to the Secretary of State, fell on their sword, took responsibility and offered their resignation, at least offered their resignation, and usually followed through. So when the Falklands War began, there was a recognition that there had been failings, and the Foreign Secretary of the day resigned, recognising that whether or not he personally was liable, he took responsibility for where his department had not been ready. You take responsibility. This applies, I believe, in families as well, that if, as complementarians, we refer to the husband and the father as having this headship responsibility, then it's primarily about responsibility. You take responsibility for your family. And that means pastors, elders, take responsibility for their churches and the culture within their churches. It means that senior leaders within denominations and networks and the wider church have to carry responsibility for what is happening. And that's because when we see things like when we see abuse, like some of the scandals that we've seen in recent years, when we see moral failure, when we see the church failing in its gospel mission, then that's not just about a few rotten apples. It is about the whole culture of how the church functions. And that culture is shaped by the example and the teaching of those who are prominent within the church, either within the local church or the wider church. They themselves are products of the church, of its culture, of what is acceptable and permissible, but they also have an input into it so that they shape the culture. And that should be a challenge, particularly if you're listening in and you are a leader in the church. We may not always think we're to blame, but we always take responsibility. I want to encourage you to think now about your responsibility within the culture of your local church and the wider church, particularly talking to those that are involved in or considering getting involved in church planting. We want healthy churches. And on this, I remember a quote from, I think it was R. Kent Hughes, that I found so challenging, so helpful, but also so challenging as well, that he said that what we believe the church should look like in macro, the church body as a family, well, we need to ensure that our own immediate family looks like in micro. Now, that's what you see, isn't it? In 1 Timothy 3, when Paul says these are the qualifications for an elder, similarly in Titus, he says, look at their family life, look at their personal character and their family life, because the church will reflect that. We set the example, we set the tone, we set the pace. Those are two questions to leave you with today. First of all, in what way has the culture of the church shaped and moulded you? Has that been good and healthy, or bad, or a mixture? And now think about your own responsibility. In what ways have I influenced and shaped the culture of our local church and the wider church? To what extent do I reflect that? So to what extent do I reflect, am I shaped by the culture of the church? And to what extent am I shaping the church? To what extent does it reflect me? Things just to get you thinking and talking, maybe talk about them with other leaders as well, just so that we challenge one another, sharpen iron, and hold each other accountable. Thank you.